There is a story that people tell about America. It goes like this. America is deeply and irreparably flawed. A racist country. Hatred lurks around every corner. White supremacy is on the rise. The Ku Klux Klan is making a comeback. Fascism is just at the doorstep. If you don't donate money, if you don't vote the right way, if you don't support the right organizations, then darkness will swallow this country whole. A powerful story. It's told on screens, printed in newspapers. It's been spoken and continues to be spoken from university lecterns. Millions have been raised through this story, building entire empires of influence. But the thing is, well, to put it mildly, it's a fabricated story. Well, I mean, it's not exactly true, and now the federal grand jury concluded that the prosecution has enough grounds and evidence to begin prosecuting the Southern Poverty Law Center for criminal activity. I'll tell you what this center is and why it marks an era in American life. Here's another remarkable story about how Iran attacked 3 ships in the Persian Gulf. The ships, of course, were commercial vessels. Well, you wouldn't attack military ships, right? And 2 of them were towed to Iranian ports, or ordered them. I don't know, he didn't drag them with a rope, but somehow just gave the order. It's absolutely idiotic, contradicting any logic, including common sense, just to say, I'm Tarzan pounding my chest. But more on that later. But first, about another powerful deception. About how the world keeps making the same mistake over and over again. About the ghost of Munich, which still wanders the corridors of European parliaments. The ghost of communism has already settled there, but the ghost of Munich is still roaming. So now let's call this section something like the threat that people try to ignore. Before we talk about how the Trump administration divides NATO allies into loyal and disloyal, it's worth asking ourselves a question that European leaders have stubbornly avoided for many years. What exactly is Iran, really? The answer was known long before the start of this latest war. You didn't need to look for it in classified intelligence reports. It was openly available in reports from international inspectors, in public statements from Tehran itself. Mostly in public statements from Tehran itself. In May 1925, the IAEA recorded that Iran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium increased by about 50% in 3 months, putting Tehran one step away from having enough fissile material for 10 nuclear bombs. Then they clarified that it's enough for as many as 11. According to the U.S. Central Command, back in 1922, Iran had more than 3,000 ballistic missiles. These are of various types. By 1926, the estimate was already over 2,000 medium-range missiles. This number kept growing. This is not some abstract threat somewhere out there in the Middle East. This concerns all of us. The Iranian arsenal, mostly missiles with a range from 1,300 to 2,000 kilometers, covers the entire Middle East and a significant part of southern and central Europe. Among the potential targets are major cities. Medium. The Mediterranean. I almost said the Middle Ages. And in November 1925, Iran announced the successful development of an intercontinental ballistic missile, and they claimed that it can fly 10,000 kilometers. Well, London, Berlin, gentlemen, as well as Washington and New York. Secretary of State Rubio reported that the country produces over 100 ballistic missiles per month. The country is Iran. Sanctions did not stop the process. European intelligence agencies and independent journalists have recorded large shipments of chemical precursors for rocket fuel from China, in total about 3,000 tons. This happened after the sanctions regime was reinstated. What we saw was not just a country, but a mystery, hiding a modest nuclear program just in case. Well, let's say, so to speak, a dangerous viper, a snake, a cobra. What kind of snake? A gyrza. It was a country that systematically opened up and methodically built the capability to carry out a nuclear strike on targets from Tel Aviv to Rome, and the whole world saw it. Europe watched and stayed silent. Did Europe see it? Absolutely. European intelligence agencies tracked the supply of precursors, published classified reports, and took part in years-long negotiations on nuclear deals. Europe witnessed it all but chose persuasion. They convinced themselves that the threat didn't concern them, that it was a regional problem, that they were only fighting with Israel, that diplomacy hadn't been exhausted yet, and that the main thing was not to provoke anyone. Well, just like with Hitler and then with North Korea, when in February 2026, the U.S. and Israel launched a joint operation against nuclear facilities and missile infrastructure, the reaction of Western Europe turned out to be not just predictable, it was eerily familiar. The German Minister of Defense summed up the general mood of Europe in the briefest terms. This is not our war. We didn't start it. Well, we know you didn't start it, ladies and gentlemen. It's a nice phrase, very convenient, but it was exactly this phrase, word for word, and even the intonation, that European leaders used in 1936 when Hitler sent troops into the Rhineland, blatantly violating the Treaty of Versailles, in 1938 when he annexed Austria. And on the eve of Munich, when Chamberlain got on a plane, returned to London with a piece of paper and uttered words that went down in history as a symbol of catastrophic self-deception. Peace. Peace in our time. Peace. Anatomy of self-deception. Peace. Peace. The parallel with the era of appeasement, as it is called in English, is not just decorative rhetoric, it is structural. This is the same psychological and political mechanism, reproduced with astonishing accuracy. In the 1930s, Europe had all the information. Germany was openly violating the Treaty of Versailles, rearming at an unprecedented speed, and absorbing territory one after another. Each time there was an explanation for why this particular step was not yet a reason for a tough response. The Rhineland, German territory, historically. Austria, well, it wanted unification itself. Look at how people welcome the troops. That's how it works in court, right? Germans live there, so isn't it logical that they want to be with Germany? Each concession seemed locally reasonable. Systemically, each one was a step toward disaster. He reproduced this scheme with enviable skill. For years, there were round after round of negotiations in beautiful European capitals, complete with diplomatic protocol and joint statements. They created the appearance of diplomatic progress. See, diplomacy works. At the same time, the centrifuges didn't stop for a single day. The missile program was expanding, and the network of proxies from Yemen to Lebanon was growing. The Iranian foreign minister publicly stated that the country was deliberately limiting the range of its missiles to 2,000 kilometers. This reassured Europe, while engineers in secret facilities were working on intercontinental systems. Diplomacy served as a cover, not an alternative. Europe, just like in the 1930s, preferred to trust words rather than deeds. They preferred hope, as they said, over analysis. We'd rather hope than think. Why should we think? Let's just hope. Faith. The only difference from Munich is just one thing. Back then, at least, there was a sense that a choice was inevitable. The leaders at that time, when making concessions, understood that they were making concessions. Today's European elites apparently are sincerely convinced that the threat does not concern them. As long as the rockets are flying toward Tel Aviv, they are in Berlin. This is no longer cowardice. This is, let's say, a detachment from reality. The kindest words that come to mind, the softest words that come to mind. Pacifism as a luxury. To understand why Europe has once again fallen into the same trap, we need to understand its history, not by judging, but by analyzing. The very same Europe that today refuses to send frigates to the Strait of Hormuz just 100 years ago owned most of the planet. Remember? The British Empire, the French Empire, the Portuguese Empire, a colonial empire. That was an aggressive, expansionist Europe using force as a regular tool of politics. That Europe didn't ask for permission from the international community. Two world wars, which claimed tens of millions of lives on European soil, caused an irreversible civilizational shift. Europe went through a collective trauma of such magnitude that it rethought its way of life. It reconsidered the nature of power and its application. It chose a fundamentally different model of existence, dialogue instead of force, integration instead of expansion, soft power along with hard power. This choice is not about weakness but hard-earned wisdom. Only the wisdom turned out not to be wise. This wisdom gave Europe 70 years of peace within its own borders. This is an unprecedented result for a continent that was torn apart by wars for centuries. But this model has one problem. There are many problems, but one just hangs over everything. This model only works in a world where all the other players are either angels of God or have agreed to play by the same rules, which is basically the same thing. When a regime appears on the scene that acts according to the logic of old Europe, the logic of force, expansion, and ideological messianism, European pacifism stops being a virtue and becomes foolishness. Complete nightmarish foolishness, idiocy. Iran, with its doctrine of exporting the Islamic Revolution, with rhetoric about destroying Israel, with an extensive network of armed proxies. That's exactly the kind of player it is. That's how it operates. Just like Europe acted during its imperial heyday, brutally, ideologically, without regard for others' norms or losses. The tragedy is that Europe knows this. It just prefers not to face what it knows. Trump, NATO, and the price of taking a stance. Against this backdrop, a sharp conflict is unfolding between Washington and its European allies. The Trump administration is considering the redeployment of American forces within NATO. Depending on how each member country behaved during the Iranian campaign, it is proposed to withdraw troops from countries that America considers disloyal and redeploy them to places where American actions received support. In his assessment, Trump is unlikely to be mistaken. The Iranian threat was real, and those who pretend not to notice it bear part of the responsibility for allowing it to grow to its current size. But his method of treatment undermines the very tool that makes collective security not just a declaration, but a reality. NATO is not a coalition of interests, assembled anew for each specific conflict. It is a system of mutual obligations, whose value lies precisely in its unconditional nature. Article 5 only works when every member of the alliance knows it will work for them as well, regardless of how convenient or inconvenient their position was yesterday. As soon as the alliance turns into a mechanism for rewarding loyalty and punishing dissent, it ceases to be an alliance, and that's a strategic problem, and that includes the United States of America. I'm not talking about whether it's necessary or not right now. Most likely, NATO has already outlived its usefulness and something else needs to be organized differently. I'm talking about where this leads. Meanwhile, Russia is only benefiting from all this. The global surge in oil prices is filling its budget. This won't last very long, but still, the war in the Middle East is distracting Western attention from Ukraine. Moscow likes the rift between Washington and Brussels. A gift for Moscow, which it has received. Well, I would say it didn't even have to give up much for it. The lesson of Munich is not that you have to fight always and everywhere. It's that the price of delay turns out to be incomparably higher than the price of timely action. The countries in the 1930s that said, "This is not our war," found it in their own homes. But by then, it was much more difficult and costly to deal with it. Whether this history will repeat itself depends on whether Europe can remember its own experience before it happens again in practice. And now let's return to our story about fabricated enemies. What was unfolding not in the Middle East, but right in the heart of America? Who and why? The answer to the question of who is both simple and staggering at the same time. Famous throughout the country, praised by the media, favored by politicians from both parties, by the way, the Southern Poverty Law Center, founded in 1971 with a noble mission, by the way, to use the law to fight racial injustice in the Deep South. In its early years, the Southern Center took on real cases. It sued the Ku Klux Klan in court and won. It achieved rulings that bankrupted the most brutal white supremacist organizations. Its founders risked their lives. They were threatened by killers. Their main office was burned down, and yet they continued their work. That was heroism, and it deserves to be remembered separately from what the organization became later. By the 1990s, I can't pinpoint the exact moment, but the 90s, something changed. The organization accumulated huge amounts of money, hundreds of millions of dollars, donations from people all over the country, from honest, concerned citizens, people convinced they were funding the forefront of the fight against racism, which somewhere down there, deep in the South, is still terrifying and nightmarish. The Southern Center turned into a professional fundraising machine, and any such machine requires only one product. That product became fear. Fear of white America, fear of the Klan, hiding around every corner, fear of fascism, which was lurking in the next block, and now its shadow is looming right over us. And as long as this fear was being sold, the machine kept running. Money kept coming in. Influence kept growing. The party kept going. Meanwhile, the country, and thanks to the center's efforts as well, slowly, not easily, but surely, was moving in a different direction. What was really happening? By 2000 and in 2010, overt organized racism in the U.S. was dying. It wasn't dead. Human nature is such that prejudice doesn't disappear on schedule. History leaves shadows that live for a very long time. But racism as a movement, as an institution, as an organized political force was practically collapsing under its own weight. Without anyone's help, the Ku Klux Klan had between 4 and 6 million members at the peak of its influence in the 1920s out in the open. In broad daylight, they marched in Washington along Pennsylvania Avenue. And by the early 2000s, it had shrunk to 5,000 people across the country, scattered, aging, impoverished, and fighting among themselves over membership dues and minor ideological disagreements. They gathered in other people's garages, living rooms, and they couldn't attract anyone born after the era of Elvis Presley. Neo-Nazi organizations were in the same state of decay. Websites were collapsing. More journalists and counter-protesters came to rallies than supporters. Leaders were being arrested, and they just left, unable to endure either the absurdity or the poverty. America, imperfect, contradictory, never ceasing to criticize itself. It was winning the long battle against organized hatred. That was the truth. But the truth turned out to be terrible for business. $3 million to keep the fire burning. On April 21, 2026, the U.S. Department of Justice announced that a federal grand jury had issued an indictment against the Southern Poverty Law Center. 11 counts in the indictment, 6 counts of wire fraud, 4 counts of bank fraud conspiracy to launder money. The essence of the accusation is striking in its monstrous irony. Between 2014 and 2023, the Southern Center secretly sent more than $3 million, money that was donated by honest Americans, convinced that they were fighting racism, that they were helping people. This money was donated, and it was handed over to those involved in violence. Extremist groups. What kind of groups, you may ask? I'll answer. Ku Klux Klan, Aryan Nations, National Socialist Movement. The order, and to conceal these payments, the organization. Which organization? The Southern one. That's the one. Supposedly, accounts were created for fake companies, Fox Photography, Rare Books Warehouse, fictitious structures with made-up names. Their only purpose was to hide where the donated money was really going. So where was it going? According to the indictment, it was used to maintain the very fire the organization swore to extinguish. The glazier and the boy who breaks the windows. The organization is best known in America for identifying and exposing hate groups. the very same one that sent out letters with photos of the Klan rallies, with requests for donations. It published hate maps with dangerous spots in every state. It appeared on all major TV channels with warnings about the growing nightmarish new wave of white nationalism. It paid people. In these photos, it financed those very groups, the groups it depicted later on its maps. The monster was real, not as powerful and strong as the center tried to portray it. But the main thing, that this very Southern Center helped to feed it. It seems that without the Southern Center, all these monsters, well, and most of them, would have ceased to exist a long time ago. That means the donations to the Southern Center would have ended too. Do you remember the short film The Kid by Charlie Chaplin? The boy runs ahead and breaks the windows. The glazier follows and offers to fix them. Quite a coincidence. No sooner has the glass shattered than someone appears who can fix everything. In the movies, it's funny. In real life, when it comes to the fate of a country, trust between people and real hatred, which is deliberately fueled for profit, that's not funny. Not at all. The mechanism worked simply and cynically when donations decreased. When the real threat diminished, the machine found a way to feed itself, to pay people inside the groups, to support their existence, to organize events, to leak information to journalists, to run a fundraising campaign, to deposit checks in the bank. Some goes into their pockets. Repeat the cycle. A self-sustaining mechanism of manufactured fear. It worked for decades, paid for by millions of Americans who had no idea about it, and at the same time it was dividing the country in half, sowing mutual distrust among people, which would not have arisen on its own. Accusation. Indictment. This is not an isolated scandal. This is the clearest and most legally documented example. Patterns that have been growing for years, an entire industry's need for the problem they are supposed to solve never to be solved, would never be solved. Not because all these people are villains, many of them sincerely believed, and still believe in their mission, but institutions obey the laws of survival, like any organisms, and the survival of the anti-racism industry. Foundations, nonprofit organizations, consultants, university departments, media projects, they depend on one essential condition: the enemy must not disappear. They do everything possible to make sure the enemy doesn't disappear, because if the enemy disappears, the funding will disappear too, and relevance, and speaking fees, and grants, and book contracts, and donations. Those who write checks out of a sincere desire to make the world better. That's why the enemy needs to be found. To amplify. Relabel moderates as extremists, inflate isolated incidents into systemic crises, and supposedly, in the case of the Southern Center, fabricate a story about someone spitting on a grave. There's something in this story, especially painful for anyone who values the true legacy of America's civil rights. Martin Luther King Jr. gave his life fighting real oppression. He saw real fire hoses, real police dogs, real prisons, real killers. He didn't need to fabricate an enemy. The enemy was official, obvious, sanctioned by the state, written into the laws, and King defeated it not because he exaggerated the threats, but because he was honest. He called it what it was. The Southern Center chose its location, just a few blocks from the church where King preached. It was a deliberate statement. We are the heirs of this cause. We carry this torch. But to take the moral authority earned with blood and to use it for fraud that kept the Russian organization on life support for personal gain, that is not carrying the torch. That's spitting on the grave. The real America. That's what this story tells us about America itself, not about America. The one sold by the Southern Center, dark, irredeemable, requiring endless financial aid, political intervention. No, let's talk about the real America, about America, where interracial marriage was, until recently, illegal in many states. Supported by the majority of the population, about America, where a black man won twice in presidential elections. Even though predominantly our electorate is white, about America, where every major institution, every corporation, every university, every government agency, for the last 30 years has been actively and persistently working on expanding opportunities for those who were previously deprived of them. From my point of view, the pendulum has swung far in the other direction. But at least they were working. Is America perfect? No. Progress is real, but it is never final. 100%. Prejudices are part of human nature. America is made up of people. Maybe this will seem strange to someone, but Americans are people too. But the story is about a country so saturated with hatred that it requires a permanent emergency apparatus to fight the unstoppable Russian wave. This story has always been more profitable for some people than the truth, much more profitable than the truth. And in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, I still believe that we have plenty of reasons for optimism, so don't despair, because despite all the bitterness of these two stories, the American fabrication of enemies, there is something fundamentally important in them and encouraging. The truth comes to light, always. Sooner or later, sometimes later. But it comes out, the federal grand jury. I explained what that is, studied the evidence, brought charges, no reputation, no brand, no decades of praise. Praise from politicians and the media did not put anyone above the law. The prosecution acts, the documents will be examined in court. The country is watching this with open eyes. This is exactly what America is. In its normal, ordinary, and I would say best form. Not a country without mistakes, but a country capable of addressing those mistakes. To name them, to investigate them, and to judge them. Think about the path this country has taken from slavery to the Constitution, which guarantees equality for everyone, from Jim Crow laws to the Civil Rights Movement, which changed the very nature of the nation and inspired the whole world, from a country where interracial marriage was a criminal offense, to a country where most people can't even understand how something like that could have ever been banned. This isn't rhetoric. This is the real measure of the movement, truly from start to finish. We came from there to here, slowly, painfully, not in a straight line, but steadily. And now we will find out, those who shouted the loudest, that there is no such movement. America is stuck. They deliberately kept the fire going, the fire that this movement was supposed to put out. That means one thing: the real America is better than we were told. The progress is real, more than we were allowed to see. The overwhelming majority of Americans, of all backgrounds, from every corner of the country, they don't want to live in a hateful country. They go to work. Most of them raise children. They greet their neighbors, regardless of the color of their skin or the shape of their ears. And they wish the same for everyone else, what they want for themselves. This is the real America, the one that cameras rarely show because it doesn't generate clicks. No, it's, they've been killed. They collect donations. They don't build careers as fighters against racism. Let's go back to Europe for a second. European leaders have once again shown familiar weakness in the face of a threat, which they don't want to see. Munich. 2026, Operation Charlie Chaplin. Touching and funny on screen, it is terrifying and disgusting in the Southern Center version, for the fight against aggression, against poverty. In my opinion, it's about fighting poverty and common sense, fabricating an enemy in order to get funding to fight it. This wasn't invented today, but from previous experience with such manipulations, we know that a fabricated enemy does not live forever. It requires constant maintenance, constant lies, constant funding. The truth doesn't require anything, it just exists. And sooner or later it breaks through any construct. Be careful with those. Those you pay to punish your enemies, be careful with them. They may have their own reasons. To ensure those enemies never disappear, trust your country, which exposes them anyway. Trust the system. It's slow and heavy, not perfect, but it works. Trust the people, who, for the most part, just want to live in peace, with dignity, in harmony with their neighbors. This is the real America. This is it. The real America, and it is stronger than those who profit from its fear. There are periods, cataclysms, and the like, but then we hide all of it, we grind it up, and we return to the path, the one we're on. Goodbye.